Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. This panel on reproductive rights and justice is part of a year-long event series on art activism in the engaged humanities. And this is a program that has been supported, it is being supported by a wide number of entities on campus. And I just want to give a shout out to those entities really quickly. So this event series is supported by the Write Lab and the Program for Writing and Rhetoric, the College of Arts and Sciences, and the ANS Office for Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, the English Department, the Division of Student Affairs, the American Music Research Center, the CU Art Museum, the Department of Ethnic Studies, and the Center for Humanities and the Arts, as well as the Center for African and African American Studies. We are so grateful for all of the participation and support that all of these entities are contributing. Through a series of performances, speaking engagements, and workshops and community collaborations, this event series intends to galvanize the study and participation in the engaged humanities at CU Boulder and within the larger community. The engaged humanities can be defined as the cross-disciplinary effort to cultivate more inclusive, interconnected, and just communities and institutions through publicly engaged research, teaching, and creative projects. And so we're really hoping to throw more events like this, where faculty, staff, students, and community are coming together to engage on important topics that matter to everyone, and hopefully with efforts to create more just societies. So thank you all for being here in the audience, and thank you all to the panel members and moderator for being here. And thank you, Marisha, for doing everything that you've done to support this, this event series. I will hand it over now to Lila.
Hello, relatives and community members. My name is Lila. I'm a student staff working with Marisha at the College of Arts and Sciences JEDI office. We invite you to take a moment to reflect on your relationship to this land of Boulder, relationship to local Indigenous communities as guided by the university's land acknowledgement. The University of Colorado Boulder honors and recognizes the many contributions of Indigenous peoples in our state and in stewardship to land before the establishment of the state into this present moment. CU Boulder humbly acknowledges that it is located on the traditional and current homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, and many other Native nations and communities. The violent forced removal of Native people from these territories has caused devastating and lasting impacts. These histories have brought us to the present moment, where the University of Colorado Boulder is determined to commit to improving and enhancing relationships with Indigenous communities and issues locally and globally. The university will do this by recognizing and amplifying the voices of Indigenous CU Boulder students, staff, and faculty and their work, by educating, conducting research, supporting student success, and integrating Indigenous knowledge, and finally, by consulting, engaging, and working collaboratively with Native communities to enhance the university's ability to provide access and culturally sensitive support to recruit, retain, and graduate Native students in a climate that is inclusive and respectful. I now have the pleasure of introducing our moderator, Samira Mehta. Samira is an associate professor of women and gender studies and of Jewish studies. Her research and teaching focuses on the intersections of religion, culture, and gender, including the politics of family life and reproduction in the United States.
Thank you so much. I want to thank Marisha and Lori and Lila for inviting me to moderate this panel. At this point, I always start Zoom panels by saying, I live in a studio apartment. I apologize if I cannot keep the animals out of the screen. And if I manage to keep them out of the screen and you would have found them to be a pleasing diversion, I apologize for that as well. It's my pleasure today to introduce a really exciting collection of panelists. And, you know, I've thanked the people who invited me to be here. I want to also take a moment to thank every one of you for taking the time to be here in the middle of what is really a very urgent time. So I'm just going to list in the order that I've been given your names, introduce you all sort of en masse. We're then going to launch into a collection of questions for the audience. You have a Q&A function in your webinar, and if you put questions there, they'll be visible to the host, and they'll be passed on to me or to pose as we move forward. We've got 6 questions that we've prepared ahead of time for the panelists. We've asked the panelists to sort of raise their hands to answer as they feel that they have something to contribute, and we're going to be kind of calling on them as I've said to them, in some mixture of who raises their hand first and who we have not yet heard from. Sort of, you know, both of those things. And once we've made our way through those questions, we'll be opening the floor for your questions. So we have with us today Alexis Moncada, who is the outreach coordinator of Colore, which is the Colorado Organization for Latina Opportunity and Reproductive Rights. Lauren Smith, Director of Policy and Advocacy, Soul to Soul Sisters. Kate Kelly, Northern Regional Field Manager for New Era, Colorado. Warren Hern, Director and Physician of the Boulder Abortion Clinic. Jennifer Hendricks, Professor of Law here at CU Boulder. And Chenthu Jayton, Executive Director of Equity Labs. So once again, we are so grateful to you for making the time in your very busy schedules to be here with us. Those of you who are presenting, our panelists, and also those of you who are joining us. We know that, you know, this is just such a vital issue, and it also means that everyone is a little bit more pressed for time than they might like to be. So thank you. Our opening question: what do you think are the most important things that we need to keep in mind about abortion history and the fight for reproductive rights and justice here in Colorado? Dr. Hern. You are muted, Dr.
Yeah, okay, am I all right now?
You're good.
Yeah, okay, well, let me just respond to this very important question. And that is, first of all, that we're in a very peculiar situation in history. Pregnancy is not a benign condition. Women die from being pregnant. It's very important that women have proper medical care for pregnancy, and we've known that for thousands of years. And abortion is now an essential, fundamental component of women's health care in the 21st century. And we have established as an extraordinary safety record with abortion in the last 50 years, starting before Roe versus Wade. So this is a safest surgical operation in the country, but it's critical for women in many ways, and we don't have time to go into all those ways. But now, the Roe versus Wade established the constitutional right to have a safe abortion, and we have organized our lives for 50 years about that, with that knowledge. And now the Supreme Court, for the first time in history, has withdrawn and revoked a constitutional right. That is a cataclysmic fact in American history. And we have a confluence of two situations. One, this is a national catastrophe for women across the country, and it threatens the most basic health care for women without any justification whatsoever. But it is the clear, predictable consequence of the determination of the Republican Party, the Christian anti-abortion fanatics since the early 70s, to make abortion illegal throughout the country and overturn Roe versus Wade. And they have accomplished their purpose because they were politically dedicated. I have been looking down the barrel of the gun with the anti-abortion fanatics for 50 years. These people will stop at nothing, and they will accept any level of violence to achieve their goals. And we now have a situation where the Republican Party has a lock, a generational, well, at least lock on the Republican anti-abortion Catholic majority in the U.S. Supreme Court, and say they are opposed to strike down any laws at the state level designed to protect women's reproductive health. So that's where we are. That's my basic summary. And I'm not telling you how I really feel about this, but it's a very desperate situation for women and everybody else in this country.
Thank you. Thank you, Warren Hern. I think our next hand was Alexis Moncada.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Hern, for what you just said. I think when we're thinking about, the fight for reproductive justice, I think especially with the upcoming election that's just less than 2 weeks away at this point, the importance of electing people who represent our values. We know statistically that most Americans believe in the right to reproductive justice to decide what, when, and what happens to their own bodies. And we need our elected officials to represent this diversity of opinion, an overwhelming majority of people who believe in access to abortion.
And Lauren Smith.
Yeah, thank you both. I totally agree. Right now, we really need to be rooting into our values and looking ahead to see how reproductive justice is going to be touching the issues that we're seeing at the ballot box with the candidates, and of course, beyond in all the different ways that we organize. I feel like it does feel hopeless at times when we think about what has happened with the Supreme Court. So I also want to reiterate what Alexis has said about how our community really strongly affirms the need for access to abortion. We do see abortion bans all the time in our state, whether it be at the state capitol or on the ballot. For example, we had an abortion ban on the ballot in 2020. And time again, our communities have consistently turned out and said that this is not something that we accept. This is not a Colorado value to ban abortion. So I just wanted to say that because especially right now, it feels like our systems, our leaders are telling us that we don't have the right to even ask for the bare minimum of safety in our bodies. But this is really not true. Because of stigma, a lot of times it feels like it's hard to speak up. We don't feel like those pro-abortion movement is maybe quite as loud, but just anti-abortion proponents are just really, they're like Dr. Hern said, they're really organized, they're really loud, but they are few. So I just wanted to name that. I think there's a lot of hope and excitement here. I also wanted to say, just thinking historically about the fight, the organization that I work for really works to center Black women's voices. And I want to really lift up the need to do that right now, because Black women, Black people know more than ever what it's like to have our bodily autonomy and our freedom infringed on us in every single way. So we really need to make sure that we're centering marginalized communities, centering Black voices, and really thinking about who's not at the table and who should be part of these conversations. Because, if we really have an intersectional movement, we have so much power.
Thank you. And now Jennifer Hendricks.
Thanks. Picking up a little on those comments, and also I think Dr. Hern's opening statement, pregnancy is not a benign condition, I think is an important thing to keep in mind. And as we're moving forward with the new political realities and what we're trying to protect, I think it's useful to keep in mind both the anti-abortion movement for the last 50 years has been this sort of, on the one hand, fanatically focused kind of movement, but also is the vanguard of a much broader reactionary movement that is aiming at a lot of things. So I was talking with some students earlier today about the sort of hypocrisy of, we want to ban abortion because we care about fetuses and babies, but we won't fund WIC, or, we won't do anything to help children once they're born. That is hypocrisy in their message. It's not hypocrisy in their underlying value system that connects all of those things, that has to do with the subordination of women and kind of most other people too, right? Anyone sort of seen as lesser. And so I think it's important that that abortion rights be part of a broader social vision, and most particularly a social vision that includes reproductive justice writ large. One of the problems of the recent past was this phenomenon of accessibility, that abortion was legal, but very inaccessible, which created a class divide in interests, right, over who had to worry about whether they could get an abortion or not. And in the current moment, I think right now we're seeing a slightly different divide where, like, over the summer, there've been all these cases about, you know, emergency miscarriage and that kind of thing. But there is a risk of falling into trumpeting the good reasons for having an abortion as the ones that will get people sympathetic and all of that. These, you know, and it's right that the focus is there right now because it's like there is an emergency, but it's an emergency to be pregnant against your will, regardless of whether you are having a miscarriage or not. And I think it's really important that we try to not have good abortions and bad abortions, and also not have not allow the question of abortion to be disconnected from basic human dignity about raising a family, right? Deciding if you want to have, you know, have kids, how to raise them, the entire sort of, I think, social vision that that the majority of the country actually does agree with, but is politically prevented by gerrymandering from enacting.
Thank you so much, Professor Hendricks. Kate Kelly.
I just wanted to add in here, like when hearing this question, what comes to mind, kind of echoing what Lauren said earlier, is that historically, people of Colorado, especially young people, have continued to show up and support and protect abortion access here in Colorado, both at the ballot box and during the legislative session in the spring. Anywhere, like talking to young people, we've heard that young people really want to cement bodily autonomy and the freedom to choose their own future. We had a listening tour in 2021, and young people named that abortion rights were in their top 5 issues. And another like just important factor here is that young people, and in particular young people of color, hold their values on abortion relatively softly compared to the general public. So like this indicates that while young people support abortion rights, that support cannot and should not be taken for granted. And like young people are the determining factor in the political and cultural future of the United States, and cultivating their support and enthusiasm and leadership on abortion will be crucial for like ensuring the supportive, dignified, and unrestricted access we envision.
Can I ask a follow-up question about what you just said? I'm really interested, and then I'll go back on script, but I'm really interested in the juxtaposition of saying this is one of their top 5 issues, but it's held softly. Can you say more about that?
Can I gather? I'm a nervous speaker. Can I gather my thoughts and follow up?
Absolutely. I will go on to our next question, but hopefully we will be able to hear from you. Just like, let me know when you're ready to come back. So one of the things that, you know, is really very sort of obvious as if you're following the news right now, is that abortion laws are very different in different states. And we're really wondering sort of if you could say something about what are the impact of those issues sort of for us in Colorado. How does it matter what's happening in Texas or in Georgia? How do we think about the relationship between the different laws in the different states as we sort of decide what to do, as we understand what's going on? Chenthu, Jayton.
First of all, thank you for all the organizers for putting this panel together. And I just want to say I'm incredibly humbled to be to kind of share space and thoughts with you all. I think, you know, we can't necessarily look at this issue as something that is isolated within Colorado, because one of the greatest ruse of this, the Dobbs decision, is to say, we're simply sending this back to the states, right? Like that is this kind of hand waving to say, look up here, when really the agenda is over here. And I think when we look at kind of Colorado's place in this particular time and moment, certainly we have legislatively enshrined the right to reproductive rights within Colorado. And I think, going back to what Lauren said earlier, we cannot look at this issue in a race-blind way, right? Like, we know that access to abortion disproportionately affects women of color and people of color, right? So I think it's important to understand that, yes, we can say we have legislatively protected access to abortion in Colorado, but what all that means is that there are people from 26 states who now have to travel somewhere to gain access to what could potentially be life-saving medical care. And that means that limitation is going to have an even more amplified impact on people of color. And I think that's part of the reason why we can't talk about this in this kind of isolationist, here in Colorado, we're okay. We're not, because when people start coming across borders, it becomes a kind of commerce that is going to be responsive to market forces. Whoever needs it first gets it, whoever has the most money gets it, et cetera, right? So we have to talk about this in a national kind of way. The other piece that I wanted to say is we also can't kind of rest on our laurels thinking, okay, we have legislatively protected it in Colorado, therefore we are okay. When the truth is, in 2014, in 2016, in 2017, 2018, every single legislative cycle, someone has introduced legislation in the Colorado State Legislature to limit access to abortion. Yes, we've had kind of enough legislative momentum to kind of stop or stall those. But what that means is, until it is written into the Constitution of the state of Colorado, we're going to have to keep doing this over and over and over and over again, right? So, so those are some of my initial thoughts about, what this issue means in Colorado specifically, but also why we have to think about it in a national kind of landscape.
Thank you. I think the next hand is Lauren Smith. Soul to Soul Sisters. It occurred to me that I should probably remind people where you're all coming here from. So Lauren Smith of Soul to Soul Sisters.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I wanted to build on that a little bit. I think that after the Dobbs decision, it really made me understand, or just start to think more about how we are a national community in a lot of ways, and how we can really be showing up for each other and for other states. I can't speak to what it looks like in the clinics, though I know that there's been an influx of people coming from out of state to access abortion care here. Soul to Soul Sisters recently has been partnering with an organization called ARC Southeast, which is an abortion fund and logistical organization in Georgia. And I remember our meeting after the Dobbs decision came out, and they were just absolutely underwater with requests for people to support them. And they were coordinating challenging logistics for people to be able to access abortions thousands of miles away, many of them in our state and in New Mexico. So that was just really a moment that reminded me that we need to make sure that we are thinking about what our responsibility is in this state. I'm really appreciative, and I'm really glad that we have recently passed legislation to protect abortion access. But it is important, like you said, to be proactive, to be really seeing the gaps so that we can move beyond that legality and actually expand accessibility, because we still have so much more that we can be doing here in our state. And I think as we have a responsibility to be doing those things, to be pushing things further, knowing that the anti-abortion movement is not going to rest, and they're going to continue to attack our rights here. Something that's interesting about the policymaking space is that oftentimes policymakers and advocates and organizers across states share ideas, and they model legislation off of each other. So we are part of this national conversation when we're doing things here, because we can really inform strategy for other states and provide hope for other states. I think there's a cultural piece to it too. So yeah, thank you for this question.
Professor Hendricks, CU Boulder.
Yeah. So on that theme of stuff to do here, I mean, we are certainly, I think, providing hope both in that general and in the specific sense for people who are able to travel here. But you know, along my sort of theme of there was the problem of disparate access even before Dobbs. Colorado still has a state constitutional ban on public funding for abortion, which currently has exceptions, federally mandated exceptions for a few circumstances. And obviously, it's not as bad as it being criminalized, right? Because there are abortion funds and things, you know, that people can try to do to get around that. But as far as the law is concerned, you know, the law in Colorado has been doing to poor women what Texas is doing to all women, you know, for a long time now. So we have work to do in our own house on various fronts, including what the actual letter of the law is here.
Maureen Hern.
I just want to follow up on something that Professor Jayton talked about in terms of Colorado. First of all, it is true, and as others have mentioned, we have the Reproductive Health Act signed by the governor on April the 4th and his own executive orders protecting women and those who are helping them. But this is a national problem. And as far as Colorado is concerned, I have testified dozens of times since the middle 1970s in the state legislature against anti-abortion bills introduced by the Republicans in every single state legislature session. So as long as the Democrats are running the state, we're okay, but that's not a given. We can't assume that. And so one of the points that I always make is that a woman's life and health and safety should not be at the mercy of the next election, as it is now, her zip code, the color of her skin, or the language she speaks. And in fact, the consequences of illegal abortion are heavily visited much more on poor women and members of minority groups. The death rate due to pregnancy for Black women is 3 to 5 times higher than it is for white women. And so that women need to be able to get abortions for high-risk pregnancies. The other point I would simply want to make is that abortion rights and women's rights, reproductive health, right now is simply roadkill and a collateral damage for the national Republican and Christian nationalist effort to turn this into a fascist theocracy dictatorship. And if the Republicans win enough elections in next 2 weeks, they take over the electoral process in the states, then they will install Donald Trump in 2024, and that will be the end of democracy in this country. And that is a very serious, very important consequence of what's going on. And it also underscores the fact that the Republicans have achieved this dominance by using the abortion issue to get elected and win power. Meanwhile, all their wives and cousins and aunts and nieces and mistresses are getting abortions. Okay, but the point is that it has been very effective for them, and their goal has nothing to do with abortion. It's about power and using the power to consolidate Republican power.
Thank you, Dr. Hern. Our next question, you know, this is something that you've all touched on in answering some of our other questions, but I want to ask it explicitly anyway, in case there's anything that hasn't come up organically. And that is, what are the specific pressures facing reproductive health clinics, in particular abortion clinics, in Colorado right now? And again, you've started to answer this, but I just want to ask if there's anything that we haven't heard or that you would like to say more explicitly about the pressures in this current moment, in this place, with all of the provisos about the danger of like seeing ourselves in a safe zone or not, right? Dr. Hern, is your hand up again or still up? You're muted, sir.
Since I've already spoken, let me briefly say the current national political catastrophe with abortion laws, as pointed out by Professor Jayton, is across the country, and it means those of us who are in states where we can offer safe abortion services are flooded and overwhelmed with the demand, and we can't meet it. And so I'm scheduling patients several weeks out. That has terrible consequences for the women whose operations are being delayed. It increases the risk, it increases the cost, it increases the emotional stress. And as been pointed out, these women have to travel hundreds, if not thousands of miles to get a safe abortion. And you have somebody in South Texas, for example, who's working a below or at the minimum wage job, has 3 kids to take care of, doesn't have bus fare to get to the other end of town, must fly to Colorado or Washington or something else. And so those women are at great risk, and that's all across the country. So this has terrible national consequences. And it's virtually impossible for those of us who are trying to help women to keep up with all that.
Jennifer Hendricks.
So I partly kind of want to reply to, there's some questions in the chat that seem to be saying, why can't someone just hop on a plane and go get an abortion? And so first of all, obviously not everyone can just hop on a plane that costs hundreds of dollars. And people have kids at home to take care of and jobs they'll lose and all kinds of reasons. So having to travel across a huge country to get an abortion is not access. Second, since I should probably speak to the legal stuff, people have a lot of questions that have since the Texas SB 8 stuff started last year about extraterritorial power. So under current law, I don't think anyone would say that Texas, for example, could prosecute someone for coming to Colorado for an abortion. But 6 months ago, you had the right to an abortion in Texas, and the fact that that was current law and settled law didn't matter to the Supreme Court on that point. I don't have particular confidence that it would matter on the extraterritorial prosecution issue. And HIPAA does not protect your medical records when there's a criminal investigation going on. So that is probably a far down the road concern, but it's a concern worth paying attention to. I mean, I could come up right now with a legal theory that would justify that prosecution. It's not that hard. It's just a question of whether the Supreme Court wants to accept it. I'll stop there. There's more legal stuff, but.
Lauren Smith from Soul to Soul Sisters.
Yeah, obviously, maybe not obviously, but I do not have a lot of insight when it comes to the pressure that abortion clinics are facing. The other thing that I'll name about people traveling across state lines is that Governor Polis did issue an executive order that we will not be complicit in any sort of criminalization of people who seek abortions in our state that are from a state that has banned abortion. So I appreciate that we're having that conversation. It's a conversation that we've been having a lot as well with folks such as the Attorney General, protecting people that are traveling for that reason. I also thought it might be relevant to mention there's abortion clinics, and there are also crisis pregnancy centers. You might also know them as anti-abortion counseling centers. And these are centers that are specifically targeting low-income communities and communities of color with the goal of coercing a pregnant person who is seeking an abortion out of their decision. These are really insidious, and they're actually extremely common in our state. And I wanted to bring it up here because we're hearing anecdotally of people trying to make appointments out of state and traveling here and making appointments with crisis pregnancy centers, which to me, it just is so devastating. So that's, I think, needs to be part of the conversation as we think about many different things, including increasing access and how we're supporting people across the state or across the country and across the state as well.
Chenthu Jayton of Equity Labs.
I think one of the things that we have to realize is that what happens when there are, some states that have protected access to abortion and others have explicitly banned it, then what we're doing is we're commoditizing a service that has differential impact on the person who is carrying to birth in problematic ways. And what that means is if once it's commoditized, then it is susceptible to market forces, right? Like that's what happens. People who have money will get on time, safe abortions. People who don't won't. And no matter how you cut it, what should be a right that is protected for women and people with the capacity for pregnancy is now not a right. Instead, it is a for-fee service that you have to kind of access. And I think that's what we have to struggle with, right? Because I hear you when you say, yeah, someone can hop on a flight and go and get an abortion, but not everyone can do that. Not everyone has the time, the resources, the capacity to do that. And so that's what happens when you commoditize something that should be a right. And I think that is a problem. And we know that the impact is different for someone who's carrying the pregnancy to birth versus the person who is contributing a sperm, right? Like there's a difference. And I think that's what we have to recognize.
I was going to ask the next question, but I'm actually going to come back to Jennifer Hendricks, Professor of Law at CU Boulder.
I just wanted to throw in on the governor's order. While it is good that it orders agencies in Colorado not to cooperate with out-of-state prosecutions to a certain extent, it does say unless there's a court order, for example, a subpoena for medical records, for example, or anything else, cell phone records, anything that would show. So there's a limit to the resistance that you can put up unless you're willing to really resist and go to jail for it.
Thank you. I think that's such an important point to put out there. The next question that we have really dovetails wonderfully off of the comments that we were getting from Chenthu, Jayton about the different sort of the way that this impact falls differently on different people and on different bodies. We do want, however, to ask, like, how is this an issue? There's a lot of, sort of question about who does this impact? What is the overarching reach? How is this an issue for all people? Where is that a useful way to think about this? Where is it maybe not the best way to think about this, right? As we think about, like, how is this affecting people? How is this a bellwether for other rights? How should we think about this as an issue for all people, for some people more than others? And so with that, Alexis Moncada of Calore.
Yeah, so I think that when we think about, abortion, reproductive justice, this affects primarily women, but it also affects trans people, non-binary people, gender fluid people. It affects Black people, Black women, brown women, Latinas, so differently, but it affects all of us who go to seek an STI testing, an STD testing, any of us who need to take birth control medications. Like, reproductive justice is like a holistic view of the way that we interact with like medical clinics to get the things that we need to be safe and to make the decisions that we want to make. And that can extend beyond, women. And I think that while they're coming for abortion first, is setting a standard. They're saying, if we can take this away from you, we can take anything away from you. Like, they may be coming for abortion first, but everyone is at risk for what could happen next. And I think it's important to acknowledge who is primarily, victimized by these policies first and foremost, but to understand that it isn't just going to stay there. It's going to extend further, and it's going to become an issue for more and more people as we see this just like extension of like oppression and discrimination that are happening here.
Chenthu, Jayton, Equity Labs.
Yeah, I think, this is one of those things that I find kind of funny, as in not haha funny, but really is this funny kind of way. And that is the kind of the absence of largely cis men in kind of participating in this conversation. And I've had lots of these conversations, and there is this kind of hesitation to say, yeah, but is this my issue? And I have two responses to that, right? Like, one is, even if it isn't your issue, shouldn't you care enough about, the people that you love, the people who are in your community, enough to act in their best interest? And secondly, of course, it's your issue. One, because you have family, you have friends who, with the capacity for pregnancy, all of whom are at risk, who are encountering some degree of danger because of this. And secondly, you, as a cis man, you have to recognize that willingly or unwillingly, knowingly or unknowingly, you've played a part in creating this system that has devalued women's life and women's quality of life. And therefore, you have a responsibility to dismantle that system. So that's usually the way I respond when largely cis men come and say, yeah, but is this my issue? Does this really affect me? And I'm like, I don't care if it affects you. You still have a responsibility to act. And I think the nature of our community is that we are interconnected, right? Like our workplaces have women and people with the capacity for pregnancy, our families, our classrooms, all of them, we are all part of that same ecosystem. And that means if a certain population is harmed and cannot thrive, we all lose. It's really that simple. So that's my response to say, yeah, it is everybody's issue.
Lauren Smith, Soul to Soul Sisters.
Yeah, Chenthu said so much of, I think, what I wanted to say so beautifully, especially that response to men. I'm always so frustrated when this issue is framed like, oh, this is a women's issue, like this isn't something that I need to be involved in, which is categorically false, first of all, because not all pregnant people are women, and not all women have the ability to get pregnant. So yes, women are disproportionately impacted, but there's so many others that are impacted. And when we consider family planning, if it's a cis man and their partner has the ability to get pregnant, they have now also lost the ability to plan for their family together. So this is something that impacts both of them. I just want to also name just the ways, again, that this fight is so intersectional, thinking about the overturning of Roe v. Wade was not just about abortion. It was about control, about the control of Black and brown bodies, especially. And I think Professor Hendricks said it was something like, it's an emergency to be pregnant against your will, which connected very importantly to what Dr. Hern named the statistic around Black maternal mortality crisis, Black women dying at 3 to 5 times the rate of white women, regardless of socioeconomic status, which really speaks to the racism in our healthcare system, but also speaks to the importance for Black people to be able to have full reproductive control, because it can be literally deadly for us to be forced to have to give birth or to go through a pregnancy. CU Boulder, I think, actually just released a study this summer showing that maternal death would increase by 24% if a nationwide abortion ban were implemented. And then that number was actually 39% for Black women. So considering all pregnant people in this conversation is really important, especially as we know abortion bans, when they occur, actually also result in higher scrutiny and criminalization of pregnant people, which will lead to more Black and brown people being at risk of incarceration. I also want to name, again, like this issue doesn't live in a silo. When we talk about abortion, I could say a billion different issues we should be talking about, but some that come to mind are intimate partner violence and gun violence. The number one cause for pregnant women in our country is actually homicide due to intimate partner violence. And that increases when that abusive partner has access to firearms. The Dobbs decision came out around the time that the Uvalde shooting happened. And when we responded, we were very intentional in talking about how a lot of these issues are very intersectionally connected. And anti-abortion proponents recognize the way that they're the intersections, especially around things like race, for example. When we go to the Capitol, we hear a lot of specifically anti-Black rhetoric when it comes to abortion bans. People when it comes to abortion. People compare abortion to chattel slavery. They say that abortion is the number one cause of death in the Black community. It's super harmful and false, but it shows that the anti-abortion movement really knows how to think about these things as interconnected, and again, speaks to how organized they are. And so we really need to make sure that we're also having very deeply intersectional, deeply race explicit conversations about abortion with so many different people at the table.
Thank you, Lauren Smith. Jennifer Hendricks.
So a lot of what Lauren just said is stuff I wanted to say. I think the reproductive justice framework is so important, and it is about control. And we have a rogue Supreme Court that is taking control back for a white supremacist faction in this country. So, I mean, the abortion decision came down right around the same time also as the gun rights decision out of New York, which was an even more ridiculous opinion from any perspective of legitimate reasoning, but it doesn't matter. They have 6 votes. And that is what we are up against, is a real assault on women, on people of color, to control their bodies. And reproductive justice is about abortion and sterilization and gun violence and mass incarceration, and the ability to feed and educate your children in a dignified and joyful way. Like that, all of that has to be our agenda. And then you mentioned bellwether also in your question. And so on my little theme of things to do in Colorado, we still have in our constitution, our state constitution still bans same-sex marriage. So if the Supreme Court, and it has another more complicated, nasty anti-gay provision in it also. But if the Supreme Court were to reverse the decision that made same-sex marriage a constitutional right, that would spring back into life. So that's another thing we need to clean up.
Warren Hern, Boulder Abortion Clinic. Dr. Hern, you're muted.
Pardon me. Okay, it's a very important point brought by Professor Hendricks. And remember that when the Alito memo was leaked, this revealing what they were planning to do on the Supreme Court, it was followed by a number of statements by Alito and by Justice Thomas that we're not going to stop with taking away abortion rights. We're going to think about taking away the right of privacy, the right to contraception, the right to vote. They can take away anything they want. They have established the point that they have the power to do whatever they want to do. They've made corporations people who have the right to speak, which means that you can have the elections flooded with dark money and to consolidate Republican power and the power of the rich and powerful. I mean, this is an unhinged situation. And as I said before, reproductive rights, we are most specifically concerned about, and that's how I spend my day working, helping women. But that is going to be roadkill in the process of destroying democracy, which is the objective of the currently fascist Republican Party, supported 100% and controlled by the white evangelical Christian nationalist movement, which is increasingly powerful in this country.
Thank you, Dr. Hern. Chenthu Jayton, Equity Labs.
Yeah, I want to kind of continue on something Jennifer spoke to, right? It's if we look at the kind of larger geopolitical context of kind of the rights to autonomy and the health and well-being of women, the hypocrisy of the decision making and the legislative process comes to light, right? Because if you look at where did they choose to intervene, it wasn't in kind of caregiving of women, right? Because there's huge disparities in work. It wasn't in kind of equal pay or pay justice or quality of life. And it was this issue of reproductive rights. And to me, what that says is that this wasn't a reasoned kind of judicial move. It was rather this ideology that's just dressed up in kind of legal opinion, right? And all of these other judicial decisions that are coming down are simply the same. It is a white male heteronormative ideology that seeks to enshrine the power of these particular groups, and they're simply kind of pushing it through this kind of legal process and kind of wrapping it up in legal opinion and saying, here you go, this is the kind of country we want, right? That's what we are seeing. So it's important to recognize that for what it is. And, you know, we started off with the conversation about history, and this has been a 50 years in the making of single-minded, single-issue voting over and over and over and over again, until you got to the point where you had this critical mass within both the legislative and judicial process where you could kind of enshrine ideology into legal opinion. So I think that is the arc of how we got here. And I don't think we should be under the illusion that this trajectory won't continue, because I think it will. So we have to be aware of that. And that means we have to organize, we have to mobilize, we have to change the nature of how we talk about these issues, where we talk about these issues, and kind of create this kind of agitation strategy with the same kind of single-minded determination that the pro-abortion movement has been operating. But we don't have a choice on that matter either.
So I'm actually going to, if I may, move on to our final question from that we've prepared ahead of time, and remind folks to drop questions in the chat. We've got one great question waiting, but we would love to get a couple of more. And Dr. Hern, feel free to fold your next set of comments into the next question. But basically, we're wondering where, resources are of course finite. So where should my financial support be going to have the biggest effect? And for those of us who don't have money to give at this time, we're really hoping that lots of students are listening. What are the best other ways to help in this fight? So I'm going to start with Alexis Moncada of Calore.
Yeah, I think when it comes to donations, the best place to make financial donations is to community organizations, nonprofit organizations that are fighting for reproductive justice, especially ones that focus on women of color and highlighting the experiences of Black women, Brown women, Latinas, because we already know that Black women, trans women, Latinas have been at the forefront of the reproductive justice struggle. So we need to finance the movements that are being led by them, first and foremost. I think that is really important. And if you don't have, the money, I think volunteering can be worth so much for so many different organizations, and organizing events in your own community, working with organizations that can help facilitate you leading something in your community with your friends, families, coworkers, talking to everybody about reproductive justice that's in your social circle, and not being afraid to have those conversations with other people can be just really, really valuable. We need all to be sources of education for our communities in whatever way that looks like for us. But that starts with, having conversations, and that doesn't cost anything to have a conversation with the people about what they think about what's going on right now. Do they want to have a conversation? Maybe they think something differently than you, and you guys can have a conversation about it. Is to seek out those kinds of conversations and donate your time, energy, anything to the movement.
Thank you so much. Lauren Smith from Soul to Soul Sisters.
Yeah, definitely echoing a lot of what Alexis said when it comes to financial support. Seeing what organizations are doing work in your community, also donating to abortion funds. Here in Colorado, one of our biggest abortion funds is the Cobalt Abortion Fund, but smaller organizations such as the Colorado Doula Project and Farm to Prison have smaller funds and are a little bit more grassroots. You can also donate outside of Colorado. The National Network of Abortion Funds shows kind of all of the different funds across the country. But I also understand if you don't have that financial ability to do that, what Alexis said about having these conversations and having these conversations based on a lot of what we've talked about today, which I think kind of gets into one of the Q&A questions from Linda about how we really orient our messaging in a way that's really intersectional. So making sure that you're always talking about these issues in a way that's really race explicit and is justice oriented, and you're recognizing who should be at the center, who are those marginalized voices. And just if reproductive justice is your number one issue, understanding all the things that it touches, because it is about the right to have or not have children, but it's also about the right to raise a family in a safe and healthy environment. So things like police violence, food insecurity, school funding, all of that's really deeply connected to abortion access. And we're often asked to share our voices on things like that, right? Like on the ballot this year, we're going to be voting on some things around food justice. There are some issues around economic justice on the ballot. And when you start to really, it feels like a muscle, I feel like, to kind of flex, to like start to make those connections, to understand and see like, oh, I can actually see how this is connected to what I'm passionate about. I can see how this is connected to reproductive justice or racial justice or anything else that I really care about. When you start to really do that, you can understand how you're able to use your voice in a way that's really deeply rooted in your values. So whenever you have those opportunities at the ballot box, with your family, if you want to come to the legislature, there's always opportunities to share your voice there. I think that's a really big way in which you can really show up.
So, Chenthu, Jayton.
I think in terms of the donating, I'll defer to the other experts in the room as to where that money ought to go. But for me, one of the commitments that I have made to myself is that whenever there is a cis man in the room, they do not get to leave without having this conversation with me. Because I think there is a degree of comfort that a lot of cis men have to simply sidestep this issue, not think about it, not talk about it, and most importantly, not vote based on it. And so one of the commitments that I've made is that whenever I'm in a room where I have the chance to talk to other men about this, we will talk about it, no matter how uncomfortable you are. The conversations will start from, what do you think about the Dobbs decision? Do you think there is an equal or comparative impact on the person carrying to birth versus the person who contributed to birth? Do you think it's fair or equitable for one person to bear that disproportionate burden? What do you think you should or can do? Are you okay sitting on the sidelines with it? What does it mean to the people who are in your community, the people who you love? I will ask all of those questions and, watch them struggle with that discomfort. But I think, to me, we have to recognize that the legislative halls of power are filled with largely men who are making decisions on things they do not understand, cannot empathize with. And we, especially if you're cis male, you have a role to play in that, because the nature of discourse is that conversations move in particular circles. And unless and until those conversations kind of migrate into circles of men, we're going to have a problem. We're not going to have enough inertia to start changing them. So that's kind of the commitment that I've made to myself. And I encourage every single cis male who's on this call to do the same. If they're in your circle, they do not get to sit on the sidelines without thinking about this.
Thank you so much, Chenthu, Jayton. Kate Kelly from New Era, Colorado.
I think something else, it sounds really small, but it was really important, like in my journey, starting to get involved in like this fight, is just starting by like embracing and really using the word abortion to aid towards the destigmatization of the topic. When I started out, even like in my organizing job, I like fully identified as pro-abortion, but when I would talk to my friends about my job, I found myself like not wanting to use the word abortion and wanting to kind of use like more socially acceptable quote language at the time. But like coming to the realization that like to be pro-abortion and to like work towards creating a society where, folks have equal and equitable access to abortion, it starts with embracing like being able to say the word and talk about it. And so by using the word abortion like boldly and without shame, we're just contributing towards a culture where folks don't feel like they need to like hide the fact that they got an abortion and or like that they feel ashamed. Yeah, and I think just embracing the word abortion is somewhere to start as well that like I didn't consider until I got into it.
So we've got some excellent questions coming in the Q&A from one of our organizers. And actually, in part because of what you just said, Kate, I'm going to read one of the questions. I've realized that I'm not sure whether people want their names shared, and so I'm going to read them anonymously. So I have a comment from someone who says, Dr. Hern, I would first like to thank you for providing me with your services 20 years ago. I wouldn't be here where I was without you and your clinic. You mentioned your growing concern regarding the lack of abortion practitioners. Do you see certain reasons for less doctors becoming abortion providers, such as personal safety or beliefs, or is it just a general lessening of medical providers overall? And I started with that question because I just felt like talking about using the word and decreasing shame and having somebody open with her thanks for Dr. Hern's services seemed so fitting. But Dr. Hern, I turn the question to you.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, whoever you are, and I'm glad I could help you. It's my main professional activity, and I'm more committed to it every single day. I would like to just, in the process of getting to the main question you're talking about there, is mention that several people have used the term pro-abortion. There is no pro-abortion movement. There's a pro-choice movement any more than there is a pro-appendectomy movement or a pro-splenectomy movement. This is women's healthcare. It's basic women's healthcare. And I think that it's very important to understand and recognize that the abortion is not the answer for every woman for her pregnancy. Obviously, I see many women who have desired pregnancy, they want to have a baby, they don't want to have an abortion, but they're ending the pregnancy for very specific, difficult medical reasons. The second thing is that I want to stop at the question of how many people who are helping women. There are no abortion providers. I am not an abortion provider. I am a physician. I do not provide abortions. I perform abortions. I did not go to provider school to become a provider. I went to medical school to become a physician. And so it's very important to recognize the dignity of medical practice. In fact, this is a very intensely personal service that one person is doing for the other person. It's not like providing Meals on Wheels or providing screwdrivers to the Pentagon. So I mean, it's very important that this human element is recognized, and I find the term provider very offensive. Let me get to the other thing that the question is about, and this link to this. It is very difficult to find young physicians who really want to do this work and who will deal with the commitment of this. This is difficult work. You risk your life. It's very long hours, and many times, in many situations, very poor compensation. But I think that, and then doctors want status more than they want money. And so in this situation, performing abortions has a lower social status in medicine than the guys doing insurance physical exams. So if you want to have high status as a physician, you don't do abortions, okay? But I think that there are young doctors who want to do this, and it's difficult for them to find acceptable place where they can get trained and learn how to do this properly, even in residency training program and even programs that are supposedly teaching people family planning. As my impression, they really don't teach people very much how to do this properly. Anyway, I think that the political climate that we have, that I've mentioned and we all know about, is very much detrimental to young physicians wanting to go in to do this work. It's very, very problematical. You want to base your life on a steady situation where you can continue your profession and helping people and expect to have a normal life of some kind, to have a normal income and be able to have your family life and your home and all the rest. The outrageous psychotic politics of the Republican Party and the Christian nationalists are making that very, very difficult. So I would say that if you want to talk about how you help, we hear that one of the problems with liberals is they're very reasonable and they want to be good citizens. That's great, but we're not dealing with reasonable people on the other side, when we're dealing with people who want to destroy democracy and constitutional government. And so, you know, if you want to talk about where you're going to put your money, you're going to help, go find pro-choice candidates for public office and help them and support them. Right now, that means Democrats. If the Republicans are running anything, there is no hope. It's a fascist party, and they're determined to destroy democracy in this country. So I'm holding back again, but that's sort of what I would respond to that question.
Thank you so much. Jennifer Hendricks, you've put your hand up.
Yeah, I'll just say go find pro-choice candidates or go be one. So one of the ways the right has succeeded on this issue and on so many related issues is I feel like liberals in general want to like go fix everything nationally once. The right wing has been taking over school boards and election commissions and the dog catcher's office for decades. And you know what? If you run for dog catcher, you get some political experience and you can run for the legislature. So the local organizing piece that I think Alexis maybe was talking about some is super important. You can't like, and it's the way around helplessness too, right? There is nothing you can do about the Supreme Court right now in any way that's going to have like immediately satisfying results. But you know, it took them 50 years. Hopefully it's not going to take us as long. We don't have that long for the climate or anything else, but local organizing, organizing communities, taking power at every level is what needs to happen.
So I wanted to return before we go back to the audience questions to Kate Kelly. I had asked you earlier about the sort of idea that this issue, abortion, is in the top 5 for so many young people. I'm also a little curious as to what counts as a young person, right? Demographically, what age group are you talking about there? And also, but like also that you're saying it's a soft issue, so we can't take that support for granted. And that really, that contrast struck me, that it's a top issue, but a soft issue. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what that means and what you see the ramifications of both sort of the strength of the commitment and maybe the flexibility of the commitment to mean.
Yeah, I think first, so at least New Era's perspective, young folks are anywhere age 18 to 35. So that's kind of what we base off of when we talk about young people. And then, yeah, kind of revisiting my point, is that like young people don't really see abortion as like such a black and white issue as like more older generations do. They hold like more nuance to the reality of abortion. Like no one's pregnancy fits into a perfect category or a box. And so while members of older generations like are relatively like steadfast in the identification of like pro-choice or pro-life, a lot of millennials and Gen Z often identify as both. And so, however, like with that, young people do understand like the importance of having abortion access as like a protected right. You know, they recognize that this issue is something that needs to be fought for, like especially in the last couple of years. I think young people have like looked around and noticed that something is not right. And, you know, that's kind of why it's like risen as a top issue for young people, while they're also just acknowledging the like complexity that like each pregnancy is like its own unique case. Yeah, I think that would answer. Yeah.
Thank you so much. We have a question. Someone is asking, how should we inform and enlighten those who are opposed to reproductive rights, reproductive justice, reproductive health access in general? Like, how do we paint a picture of the struggle that people face to those who just don't understand the struggle? I'm going to go first to Chenthu Jayton and then to Warren Hern.
Yeah, and I want to kind of approach this question in a couple of different ways. One is kind of like I said, the discursive nature of how ideas then become movements that then become kind of legislation and law, right? And I want to start with this question, right? Like, how many of y'all can think or identify a movie or a TV show that celebrates an abortion, right? And you'll really quickly realize there aren't a lot of those. And part of that, I think, is this erasure project, where the struggles, the needs, the reasons, all of that is just kind of hidden from public discourse, right? That kind of storytelling is not a part of our national conversation. And as long as it remains such, the reason to then kind of humanize and empathize with people enough to start taking legislative action remains fairly low. So I think part of it is we need more of these stories, no matter how personal and painful and difficult they might be. They need to kind of come into public circulation. They need to be rewarded. They need to be paid. They need to be valued, so that that kind of storytelling is much more visible to us. Because right now we hide this. We hide this in the darkest, deepest corners of society and try never to talk about it. So I think that is one thing. We need to kind of get these stories, elevate them, and celebrate them. And secondly, you know, like I said, we can start by just asking questions of people who are in this kind of anti-abortion kind of idea to figure out if the kind of ideologies that underpin this larger opinion that I am not going to vote for pro-choice or pro-rights candidates, right? Because if it is in fact an ideology, it is standing on some assumptions. And those assumptions in these cases are women aren't harmed. There isn't a disparate kind of impact on women of color and people of color, that and there's a whole host of assumptions on when a fetus is viable, et cetera, et cetera. Like all of these underpin this kind of false ideology. And I think when you start asking questions, getting people to research and think and talk with some of these things, then we start to chip away at this incredibly harmful and unproductive idea that somehow we are in fact protecting life, when the truth of it is you aren't, and you're substantially harming quality of life for an entire host of people.
Dr. Hern.
Yeah, first let me say that using the term pro-life makes me ask, when you say pro-life, do you mean me or the people on my sidewalk who want to kill me because I am saving women's lives? This is a lie. It's an obscene propaganda term. Please do not use it. The second thing I would say, that the stories of women who needed abortions and who died from unsafe, illegal abortions have been being presented to the public for a century. It makes no difference. Any time that you spend trying to convince an anti-abortion person to change their point of view, or to spend the time with the energy, is a colossal and a monumental waste of time and energy. If you really want to be effective, you go find candidates for public office who are pro-choice and make sure they get elected. You find the people who are and agree with you and get them to the polls to cast their vote. This is about which way the guns are pointed. It has nothing to do with logic, reason, facts, blood loss, compassion, or any of that stuff. It has to do with power. And the sooner that the people who want women to have safe abortions understand that, the sooner we have a chance of reversing the catastrophic political consequences of Donald Trump's election and the half-century-long move by the Christian nationalists to turn this into a Christian nationalist fascist theocracy.
Thank you, Warren Hern. Lauren Smith, Soul to Soul Sisters.
Yeah, I wanted to re-emphasize Chenthu's point on storytelling. Even if it's not always effective for moving communities, it is also always effective for destigmatizing the issue and for people who are hearing these stories and might have their own stories. They can feel more compelled to speak. I think I said it earlier on in our discussion that sometimes it feels like the anti-abortion movement is really large because they're simply so loud. And that's because of the stigma that we really experience from that other side. So there's still so much power in reminding people that they're not alone there and making sure that we are building relationships, valuing these stories, compensating people for their stories. I think understanding the root of why someone is opposed can be helpful in some cases. I've had conversations with people where they just simply don't understand how abortion works. They don't understand how extremely common it is, how likely it is that they will know someone in their lifetime that has had an abortion, even if they don't tell them, which they might not, depending on the views that they hold. Or, they think that it's potentially dangerous. Misinformation is still so rampant when it comes to abortion. So if that is just the root of why they feel opposed, oftentimes we can't have a good conversation. I do find that when it comes from a place of morality or from religious beliefs, that can be more challenging. And I advise you to protect your peace when it makes more sense to do so, because sometimes you get twisted in these conversations. And at that point, you're debating human rights. And that's not necessarily a conversation that should actually be happening. And I really advise that you don't, when you're having these conversations, that you don't stigmatize the issue in the way that you talk about it. I think, as Dr. Hern said, a lot of times we parade out these stories of the most tragic possible cases of people dying because they can't access abortion or whatever it is. And that's not the most common reason that people access abortions. It's really leaving out a big chunk of the story. It's really not highlighting Black and Brown people who are facing economic barriers and can't afford to have children, or just someone who just chooses to have an abortion. Some people are, it's a difficult decision to make, but they are glad that they had the opportunity and were able to make that decision. So not always parading out the tragedy around abortion, because it isn't tragic. It's important and it's helpful and it's valuable. So I just wanted to say that too, is like, as you're thinking about how you communicate, don't stigmatize the issue. Don't pit different types of abortion against each other for the sake of trying to move somebody, because that actually really hurts us as we think about how to really build a longer term destigmatizing narrative.
Chenthu, Jayton.
Yeah, I just want to quickly kind of respond to Dr. Hern's statements, right? Like, you're right. I think engaging in a kind of conversation on logic and reason do tend to fail, especially when it is ideological in nature and driven by morality more than anything. And I think, to me, that's, and in truth, anybody who's ever told you that logic is what convinces people to act in a particular way, they've always been lying to you, right? Affect, emotion is much more at the root of convincing someone to act in particular ways than logic has. And certainly, the kind of Christian conservative movement has weaponized that in very productive ways, right? Because what can be more kind of evoking sympathy than the idea that you're killing, a fetus or a baby, right? Like, that evokes emotion and that can be weaponized. And so I think part of why I bring the idea of storytelling is that storytelling is one of those methods that has an evocative component in addition to the logical component of it. And that's why I think there is value in elevating those kinds of stories, because you're right. I don't think logic and reason alone is going to change this trend. All the more reason why the humanities and the arts need to be a part of this process of kind of changing the way we storytell around this particular issue. So this panel makes a lot of sense for this particular project.
Well, thank you so much for saying that, because you've just perfectly set up the next question that I wanted to ask. This time I am going to say who it comes from, because it comes from one of our organizers. So this is from Lori Ellen Grease. And she says, because this is a series on art and activism, I want to ask you how you see art playing a role in effectively addressing this issue. She notes, today in my class on writing and public activism, we discussed how many genres have been historically important in the fight for reproductive rights and justice. Petitions, manifestos, abortion stories, etc. What are some of the most powerful genres of art we might embrace today that have potential to enact social change around this issue? Chenthu, Jayton.
You know, I am by training a communications scholar, and you know, one of the things that we talk about is whenever you put an artifact and ask people to turn toward it, you're already going to lose 2/3 of the population. Instead, you put the artifact exactly where someone's line of sight is. And I think right now that is our kind of short vignette social medias, right? Like the Instagram stories, the TikToks, etc. And I think that means this storytelling also has to happen there with the same kind of evocative potential, with the same kind of nuance that reproductive rights requires, with the same kind of depth and humanity that it requires. And all of that presents, I'm sure, a pretty challenging kind of narrativizing. But I think that's what we need to do. Right? Like, I am not the most creative person in the world, but I trust there are people who can do justice to this kind of storytelling and put them in front of the millions of young people, potential voters who can potentially change the tide on this. So to me, that's the platform. That's the kind of genre that we need to kind of expand into, because we know that the rate of reading books and newspapers is down. We know the rates of listening to poetry is down. We know the rate of listening to the radio is down. So I'd say short vignette storytelling through social media or podcasting. Those are the two places where most eyes and ears are focused on right now. And you got to put it in front of where people are already looking and listening.
Alexis, Moncada, Calore.
Yeah, echoing what he just said, but also, I think that, we've seen culturally, like even in different countries, just like the power of music when it comes to storytelling and talking about political activism. We've seen it here in the US with R&B and hip hop, how they have communicated like social messaging through that kind of music. And it's been really powerful. And I think that, like what was just said, people are moving away from maybe reading books and more into watching videos and listening to music and things like that, because they're easier for some people to access. And so making, every kind of art political could be so valuable. And it reminds me a lot about how I think about how everyone can contribute to the struggle for reproductive justice if they don't work in the field of reproductive justice. And there's always some way you can contribute in your field. And I know that there's a lot of students on this call working on different things. And I think that you can always find a way to make your career field contribute to the struggle for reproductive justice. And art is definitely one of those ways. Art can be very moving. And I think that it's a great tool to reach people who maybe aren't about reading a book or something like that. And yeah, there's just so many ways, and I think it can be incredibly powerful.
So we only have a few minutes left. I want to just call everyone's attention. Mauricia Lopez has put some messages in the chat for everyone. So an event survey that we would love to ask you to fill out, and also an invitation to submit art to a March installation. So see your chat function for those announcements. There's a question that was actually the first to go into the questions in the chat, and it's been touched on by a couple of people, but it's also really sort of in a more of a Socratic question form, I think an excellent way of summing up some of what people have said. So I'm going to read it less to invite responses and more because, again, I think it's a wonderful Socratic summation. Someone has said, if we are interconnected beings living in a highly interconnected society, isn't it everyone's issue when some pregnant people will be physically or emotionally traumatized and even die? Children will be born unwanted and then not taken care of, and then carrying trauma with them their whole lives, which again affects everyone. Isn't that fiscally and societally costly for all of us? So, you know, we have a couple of moments if anyone wants to respond in some way to that. But I also wanted to just sort of take a moment to thank all of the people who came and who posed questions and who gave us your time. So I'll take final responses to that last question, and then I'll cut everyone off with just a second to thank you all before we go. Jennifer Hendricks.
I'll respond, and thank you so much, Samira, for managing this so well. And I mean, I think everyone here agrees that the answer is yes, that is costly for all of us, and it is everyone's issue, both the specific issue of abortion and of, broadly speaking, reproductive justice. I would draw a distinction to just make sure maybe we end on the sense of urgency. That I think that's true, and I think that's the kind of conversation that one can have with a lot of people who are perhaps not very reflectively anti-abortion or things like that. But when we're talking about the political movement that we are confronting, which is increasingly a fascist movement, not in the throw a pejorative at it sense, but in a descriptive historical sense. Inflicting that pain, that suffering is the point, right? It is not a cost as far as that movement is concerned. This is a white supremacist patriarchal movement, and inflicting that suffering on women, and especially on women and people of color, is a net gain from the perspective of that movement, and that is what we are up against.
And I'm just aware that we're basically out of time. Dr. Hern, I'm so sorry. We're at the end. And I wanted to thank everybody. I really want to thank every panelist for taking the time to join us. I want to thank Lori Ellen Griest and Mauricia Lopez for inviting me to do this, for coming up with the idea. And again, all of you who are giving us this time, I really want to encourage you to take the lessons of this panel, to remember to vote, to remember to support candidates who support your values, to remember to organize, to remember to have important conversations, to take hope where there is hope to be found, to remember that this is going to be a long, long fight. And to really also underscore the point that Professor Hendricks made at the very end, and that is, to quote the journalist Adam Serwer, this is a case where the cruelty really is the point. And to think about that big picture as we move forward. Thank you so much for giving us your time today. And now, I'm gonna ask if either Mauricia or Ellen has a closing word. And again, thank you.
Yeah, thank you all so much for your participation. This has been just terrific. And I really appreciate the intersectional historical approach and the emphasis of how this is tied to white nationalism and fascism. I think that just can't be understated. And I think the complexity of those connections is messaging that we need to keep working on as well. I also want to just thank you for the emphasis on storytelling. For those of you who are on campus, we actually, Kate Kelly from New Era, Colorado, and one of her colleagues are actually giving a workshop on storytelling and the role of storytelling in the history of the fight for reproductive rights. And that is going to take place actually from 5 to 6 in Helms. And the room number is 241. It's from 5:30 to 6:30 if anybody wants to show up. I also wanted to just speak into the March installation that Donna Mejia mentioned. Donna is going to be arranging an art installation, a performance installation that's called No More Words, where we're thinking about how we can actually use say multimodal strategies of activism to fight for social change. So if anybody has any ideas, Donna's going to be curating that. And I also wanted to just give it a shout out for the next event in our series, which is going to happen on December 1st. It is a Kwanzaa celebration, and it is being organized by the Center for African and African American Studies. And that event it's a 2-part event. They're going to be looking at how the 7 principles of Aganzu Sabo can inform engaged humanities work. And it's going to be followed by a traditional Karamu feast. And so we welcome you to that event, and also just keeping an eye out for events that will take place in the spring. But for now, thank you all so much for being here, both in the audience and on the panels. We just can't thank you enough.
Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you.
Absolutely.